I want you to picture this. It's 11:23 in the morning, a cold Tuesday in Providence, and I'm sitting at this bench reviewing my docket when I look up and see a man walk through those doors wearing 30 years of medals on his chest and not 1 ounce of accountability in his soul. Chief Robert Bobby Sullivan, 48 years old, 30-year veteran of the Providence Police Department, in full dress blues, boots clicking on my courtroom floor like he owns the place. And I say like he owns the place because that is exactly what he believed. His shoulders are back, his jaw is set. He doesn't acknowledge a single person as he passes, not the other defendants, not the court staff, not even the bailiff who nodded out of habit. He walks straight to my bench, stops 3 feet away, stands at attention, stares straight ahead. And when I ask him professionally and calmly, Chief Sullivan, do you understand the charges against you? His very first words to this court are that these charges represent a, quote, fundamental misunderstanding of police procedure and chain of command authority, not a denial, not even a question, a dismissal, because in his mind, he had walked into a room that did not have the authority to question him. So I opened the file. The charges stemmed from an incident involving Officer Maria Santos, a dedicated officer who had done exactly what every officer swears an oath to do. She discovered that evidence from 3 major drug cases inside Sullivan's own department had been altered or destroyed, and she investigated it, she documented it, she brought it forward, and in return, Chief Sullivan told her she would find herself directing traffic in the worst neighborhood in the city if she didn't learn to mind her own business. And when she filed a formal complaint with Internal Affairs anyway, he called it a frivolous waste of resources, and when Lieutenant James Morrison, the IA investigator, refused to close the case without finishing his interviews, Sullivan looked him in the eye and said, your pension depends on your ability to understand when an investigation is complete. And when Detective Rachel Kim discovered additional discrepancies and Sullivan called her into his office, he gave her 2 choices: keep quiet or find herself back in uniform on overnight shifts. And I watched Sullivan stand at that bar and call every one of these things department loyalty and guidance about priorities and counseling and chain of command. And I wrote down every single word, because there is a very particular kind of man who has operated for so long without consequence that being held accountable feels to him like an assault. And that is exactly what was standing in front of me that morning. And I could see his composure eroding with every folder I opened, his jaw tightening, his face reddening, until I told him that Officer Santos had submitted her evidence to the state attorney general's office 3 days before he suspended her. And something inside him snapped completely. He stood up straighter. His voice became a shout. He told me she had gone over his head, violated chain of command, had no right. And I asked him as plainly as I know how, no right to report on police corruption to the state attorney general. And that is when he pointed his finger directly at this bench and said, in front of a full courtroom, I own you. This whole courthouse runs because my officers keep the peace. You work because I do my job. And the room exploded. People gasped. The bailiff moved, and I sat very still because 43 years on this bench have taught me that there are moments when absolute stillness is the only answer, when the room needs to see whether the law holds. And so I waited. And when the noise settled, I spoke in the quietest voice I have. Chief Sullivan, did you just tell me that you own me? And he doubled down. He told me judges owe their jobs to the protection of officers like him. And I stood up and I told the bailiff to place him under arrest for contempt of court. And as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he was still shouting that I couldn't handle the truth about how the city really works. And I sentenced him guilty on all counts of abuse of office, intimidation of witnesses, and obstruction of justice, 3 years in state prison, forfeiture of all pension benefits, permanent prohibition from law enforcement, and 1 additional year for contempt of court. And his face went white, his hands started shaking, and he asked about his family, about his children's college funds tied to the pension he had just lost. And I told him his family would find another way to pay for college, just as Officer Santos had found another way to feed her children when he suspended her for doing her job. And then something broke in him, the real kind of breaking, not performance. And he wept, and he said, I know I was wrong. And he asked whether it was her duty to report the corruption, and he answered his own question, because it was her duty to the law, not to me. And I told him, report to the Department of Corrections Friday morning at 9, And remember, Chief Sullivan, no one owns the law. The law owns all of us. He stopped at the door and turned around and asked me one thing, whether Officer Santos was okay, whether she had kept her job. And I told him she had been promoted to detective last month and now heads the department's new internal affairs unit. And he nodded and said quietly, good. She deserved that. The door's closed. 3 years later, Detective Maria Santos sat across from him in a prison visiting room and told him that the evidence he had tried to bury had led to 8 clean drug convictions. And she told him about a program for ex-offenders that teaches conflict resolution to at-risk youth. And she offered to recommend him, not the man who had threatened her career, but the man sitting in front of her, the one learning the difference between power and responsibility. And he wept again, and she told him that good policing means believing people can change, even corrupt cops. And I think about that moment often because that is what justice looks like when it completes its full arc. Not just a gavel coming down, but a disgraced man being offered a second chance by the very person he wronged most. And I want every person who has ever worn a badge or held any authority over another human being to hear this clearly. Authority is not ownership. A title does not place you above the system that grants it. And the moment you believe your rank exempts you from accountability, you have already begun to fall. You simply have not hit the ground yet. Officer Santos understood her oath better than her chief did. She understood it the day she found the tampered evidence. She understood it when he threatened her career. She understood it when she walked into the Attorney General's office alone, knowing what it might cost her. And she understood it 3 years later when she offered him not vengeance, but a way forward. And that is what this bench is for. That is what every oath of public service must mean. On your best days, and especially on your worst, the law does not belong to those who enforce it. It belongs to every single person it protects. And on that cold Tuesday morning in Providence, in this courtroom, the law held as it must, as it always must.